This is the infrastructure of modern child welfare. Despite an overwhelming lack of evidence that it's working, we persist. I suspect what's actually happening is that we have a loyalty to the idea of foster care that's going unchecked. I think if we checked it, we might notice that we're doing a great job of soothing our egos, of supporting an industry, and of listening to experts. And meanwhile, a group of people are being damaged. There's a simpler way of saying that, you know. The socially supported, systematic mistreatment of a group that has a technical term. Oppression. Oppression is a word that's usually reserved for use by good people to describe bad people doing bad things, only it turns out oppression is a tricky devil. It gets us good people unwittingly to pick up its weapons and to use them in the name of helping when we have the best of intentions in our hearts. Now, there is, I think, reason to hope. If we concede that soothing our egos isn't the same as helping, and that commodifying people is never what we meant to do, and that listening to people who are struggling might have some value, we could use this moment to move forward in a different way. Moving forward, we could align ourselves with existing activities farther upriver that are disciplined about an ounce of prevention. We could find the earliest moment to intervene with a family long before they need a catastrophic intervention like putting their kid in foster care.
Good afternoon, and welcome to the one-year anniversary of CASA LA's Fireside Chat. I am Charity Chandler Cole, the CEO of CASA LA. At CASA LA, we organize the community to show up in life and in court to advocate for children and families in LA County's overburdened child welfare and juvenile justice systems. Through an intentional, restorative, and culturally responsive lens, we train a village of committed, consistent, and caring adults who provide equitable, life-affirming connections. Our vision is a Los Angeles County in which all children and families have equitable access to the resources and support they need to be whole and thrive. Our mission and vision cannot be accomplished until our children live in a world that is equitable and just. And that's why we are committed to doing our part to address racial injustice in the child welfare and juvenile justice systems, and using this platform, our Fireside Chats, to bring communities and various stakeholders together to have real conversations about what's happening in the world of child welfare in LA County, with the hope of building awareness, informing our communities, activating a safe space for all, and strengthening our ability to advocate for our youth. Today, I have the privilege and honor of introducing you to a phenomenal group of people, all of whom have been working in various ways or another and are dedicated to transforming the lives of youth and families in LA County and beyond. We have my dear friend, Dr. Akin Adeoye, who is an advocate, an organizer, and community leader focusing on creating fair opportunities for youth in the child welfare system. In 2015, President Obama honored him as a White House champion of change. He is currently the founding director of Altura Collaborative, an organization whose mission is to connect people with lived experience to a community-driven network that supports and accelerates educational and career success. Ryan Moses is a former foster youth working to level the playing field for other youth in the system. He founded the Epicenter, a nonprofit resource center for system-involved youth in Monterey County. He is also the founder of Do Good Clothing and Foster Printing Company, two businesses that follow his 10% rule, in which he donates 10% of the proceeds to organizations that had a significant impact on his success through the foster care system. And last but certainly not least, Judge Michael Nash, who is the executive director of Los Angeles County Office of Child Protection and a former LA County supervising judge of dependency and presiding judge of juvenile court. Thank you all so much for taking the time out of your busy schedules to join us. And welcome to our Fireside Chat. For our audience, we will take a few questions towards the end if time permits. So please submit a question in the Q&A and we'll be sure to get to it. So let's get into it. Throughout the history of the United States, the child welfare system has evolved according to changing beliefs and attitudes about what role the government should play in the protection and care of children deemed abused and neglected, and the expansion of the government's influence in shaping national child welfare policy, and their involvement has been punctuated by two key ideological debates. The first is a debate about the rights of state and local governments versus the responsibility of the federal government to ensure adequate protection for all children. The second debate centers around the rights of parents versus the rights and needs of the child. For example, when the pendulum of public opinion swings toward parental rights, the goal of family preservation is viewed as paramount. Conversely, when it swings towards the rights of the child, the result is greater emphasis on ensuring child safety and protection above all else. As public awareness grows and the disproportionality and disparities that exist insofar as who enters the system and for what reasons, coupled with some of the negative experiences children have while in the system, and data that proves the drastic outcomes once they leave, not to mention the historical oppression of BIPOC communities, and even the punishment of poverty and other factors, the pendulum has now swung from that of child protection or parental rights to child and family well-being. LA County specifically is currently taking strides to reimagine the child welfare landscape, and many people with lived experience, such as myself, are now actively working to move this needle in the right direction. However, before we get to the opportunities, we need to first understand how we got here. So Dr. Akeen, I mentioned earlier that you did a powerful presentation, I can't remember how many years ago, on the history of the child welfare system. So maybe you can get us started with your thoughts, feelings, and understanding of the history of child welfare and how we got here.
Yeah, well, first, thank you so much, soon to be Dr. Charity, for having me. I think I'll start with something that a lot of my colleagues always say and share is that, we should stop calling this the child welfare system and really call it what it is, right? Like the family regulation system, right? It's really a system designed to surveil predominantly Black and brown bodies in our communities. So when we think of it as that, when we start to trace the history, right? A lot of times scholars and others will kind of trace it back to this kind of orphan train movement, right? This kind of like Charles Warren Brace, the Children's Aid Society. But what is often really left out is kind of years before that, this idea of like indentured servitude, right? Like children, and this is even before the founding of colonial, quote unquote, colonial America, right? So you have kind of kids like Benjamin Eaton. It's like, hey, parents died, and now you're like indentured out to this family who will raise you until you reach kind of this age of majority. And so I think, we have to realize that the child kind of surveilling and family surveillance system is really one around regulating Black and other kind of low income and really poor families. And it's really a system designed to keep families in this vicious cycle of surveillance and poverty with no escape.
Thank you for that. Would anyone like to add to that before I ask the next question?
Yeah, I have a few things to say about this because in a sense, I have been connected to the system, whatever you want to call it, in many respects, I'm sure longer than anybody in the room. Let's start out with the fact that my mother grew up in congregate care in the 1930s, and it negatively affected her for the rest of her life. To this day, never have been a fan of congregate care, but that's besides the point. I started out my legal career, first 15 years in the criminal justice system. And what pretty much the goal of that system is, to lock people up, basically. And truthfully, when I was there, I was good at it. In 1990, I was assigned to the dependency court, which up until that point in time, I didn't even know what it was. I didn't know that it existed. When I got a call, said, you're going to go to the dependency court, I said, well, what's that? I started there in 1990, and in a sense, it's been kind of a love affair ever since, in that I became part of something that theoretically was designed to help people. And for some reason, I have always kind of gotten off on that. And here I was, a judge in a courtroom where the goal was to help children and help their families. The question is, how have we done over the last 30 years? And, what I recognized was the potential that the system theoretically had to help people. And I can truthfully say that after it's 32 years now, 33 years, it's never truly, achieved its potential. On the other hand, when I started in the dependency court, my friends over in the criminal court said, how could you do that work? And I'd say, well, let me just put it this way. At that time, 1990, we had about 60,000 kids under the jurisdiction of the dependency court. Today, we're down about 30, and in my own courtroom, my case inventory, I had 3,300 kids, on my case inventory. And I'd say to my friends, when I think about all the people that I deal with through my court in 1 year, taking a very conservative estimate, because it's not a very good system, I'm still able to probably help, 1,000, give or take, people every year in my courtroom. And I'd say to my friends in the criminal courts, you're never going to help that many people in 20 years in that system. Okay. So don't tell me how could I be there. And of course, my mission over the years has been to work hard to hopefully work with everybody to improve the quality of the system so that the percentage of people who come through the system get helped, that get helped goes up. But at the end of the day, it's about one child at a time. And, on my worst day in the courtroom, something good happened for somebody, and there's something to be said for that. But the problem is we have needed to do, and we still need to do a whole lot better. If you look at child welfare and let's talk about history. Let's talk about some of the main legislation over the years. You start out with Title 4E, which is the funding mechanism for child welfare, has been since 1980 thereabouts. And how does Title 4E work? The system gets more money the more children that get put in foster care. That's a cockeyed way for the system to work. And there have been obviously, lots of talk about changing the financing system over the years, and it's never truly happened. Now we have FFPSA, the Families First Prevention and Services Act, which is probably the first step in doing that. But even then, it's limited in what it covers. And God knows, when, here in California, in LA County, we're going to have access to that money, so it remains to be seen. And then, you have in the mid 90s, you had AFSPA, the Adoptions and Safe Families Act, which said, look, we can't have kids languishing in foster care. We have to have, more kids achieve permanency, hopefully through, primarily through adoption at that point. And what did that statute do? It said, prior to that statute, there were 5 types of cases that got no family reunification rights at all. That statute extended it to, at the time, 16. I don't know how many categories of non-family reunification cases there are now, okay? But I will tell you that after ASFA passed, after a couple of years, we had in Los Angeles County, we had 6,000 children whose parental rights were terminated, who were waiting to have their adoptions completed. And it took probably 2 to 4 years for that to happen. And of course, one of the things that came out of that was National Adoption Day that started here in Los Angeles. Okay. And, we got a lot of critical, acclaim for that. But I will tell you, I've never been completely comfortable with all that acclaim, because adoption is a two-edged sword. On the one hand, a lot of kids get a permanent family, but on the other hand, you have to go back and say, how many of those kids could have remained with their own natural families had we provided, meaningful services in a timely manner? Okay, so there's always been that tension. Okay, now let's move forward to 2008 to fostering connections. Okay, the next really big piece of legislation, which basically, among other things, the biggest thing was it extended foster care to kids from past the age of 18 up until 21. Well, of course, you know, the goal of the system has always been safety, child, you know, keep children in a safe situation, make sure we take good care of them while we have them, well-being, and ultimately, you know, let's achieve permanency for those kids. Those kids need to grow up with a permanent family, preferably their own, okay? But if not their own, then a new family, okay? Well, certainly, how have we done with that? Well, from that, we found that too many kids weren't getting that. And so, you know, they were staying in the system in many days, in past years, till they were 18, and then we kicked them out. We kicked them out because they reached the age of majority. And we called that emancipation. What a BS title that was for what we called kids, okay? We were kicking them out of the system because they reached a certain age. Well, so now with fostering connections, we're able to keep them till age 21. Bottom line is, you know, that just means we still haven't achieved permanency for those kids. Those kids didn't grow up, you know, with their own, with a family of their own, okay? And so look at the outcomes that we've had for those kids over the years. The 18-year-olds always did pretty poorly, okay? You know, the 21-year-olds do a little bit better, okay, because they're a little older, perhaps a little bit wiser, but in the long term, the outcomes have never been good. So fostering connections, you know, when it passed at the time, I said, look, we have all these kids and we have to do whatever we can to help them, okay? However, at the same time, we have to redouble our efforts at creating permanency for these kids so that fewer of them actually become, few of them actually, you know, become kids who transition out of the system to poor outcomes, okay? How well have we done that? Well, I don't think we've done that well. We've got thousands of kids who are between the ages of 18 and 21 still in the system. We see in the last 5 years, we've averaged 1,500 plus kids in Los Angeles who are aging out of the system, okay? So it ain't working. It's not working, it's never worked. So let's look at this from a historical perspective. And I want people to understand, you know, some of this so-called key legislation that has impacted our system over the years.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you for that. A few things. One, I didn't know that your mother was in congregate care. So I just learned something new about you. And it's crazy how you use, I never made that correlation with the word emancipation. I've made so many correlations with slavery and our current child welfare system, but to hear the word emancipation and how we were emancipated from slavery without resources, and our children are emancipated from the child welfare system without resources. This light bulb just went off.
I hate that word. I hate that word, and I've hated it for over 20 years.
Yeah,
25 years.
Maybe even more now.
You know, I don't know. It's a weird space though for me. Like, you know, it's like there are these kind of like connections to slavery of like, right, emancipation. However, there is something liberatory about the freedom from a system that is not supporting your needs. Right. So I give the example of being in care when I was 17 when I started college. Mm-hmm. What this meant was, and you'll probably know where I'm going already, I was still legally a dependent of LA County foster care system, right? One of the kind of requirements that folks wanted was and this is a few years ago, so things have changed a little bit, a fingerprinting of my roommate because he was over 18 and I was 17, right? And it was just like, right? So while things have like started to shift and adapt, but like, right, these were the things, right? Like, and so for me, it was a freeing, right? It was because at some point I was like, yeah, I don't have time to meet with the social worker. Right, I'm in college. I'm doing, you know, I'm checking all the boxes. Leave me alone, right? And so then it's like, well, you know, you're not responding. You're not doing all this. So then you're going to be like absent without leave. I was like, I'm in college. Leave me alone, right? Or there was, you know, I was in the transition kind of housing program for a very short time because it didn't work. One of the requirements was that you give half of your paycheck while it was to be saved. right? And giving back to you, right? I was like, well, one, I work a regular job. I'm in college and I work a regular job. I'm not giving you half. If I were renting an apartment and we're paying half, that would be called what we call is like rent burdened, right? And so like I was like, no, I have a car note that I have to pay for. And so it's like for me, it was like actually becoming kind of disconnected and like aging out or emancipating was like a sense of like of freedom of like, all right, like I can go do what I need to do, right? Because had I gone through a process, the legal definition would be emancipation. If I were like wanted to leave early, it wouldn't be a transition out, it would be a seeking of emancipation. When people who aren't connected to dependency systems, like, yo, I got a job, I'm doing my thing, they seek legal emancipation and they're just being set free from a set of rules. And so it's like, there's like, that's the one hand, right? Like where it's like, where you can see, but then there's like, there are these negative connotations. And for me, I think it's like the calling of a spade, right? If the system isn't doing what it's supposed to do, it's almost like if we start to pacify the language in a sense, we start to then forget why it's called that. That's not, now I'm not like advocating for one way or the other.
Right. These are great points. Yeah.
Right. Because truthfully, if we think about, right, like, you pointed out like, 4E of the Social Security Act and things like that. And when we really think about upstream, my mother had 11 children who all were raised in some form of foster care, whether it be relative and, kinship kit, right? Like, but they were all receiving funding through for foster care. Plus the health insurance, plus the social workers, plus the court visits, plus the transportation. I mean, the county of Los Angeles was spending at least $20,000 a month for the, raising of my family, right? And it was a case of poverty and inability to care for children. Now, even in the 90s, $20K a month we could have just had 24/7 other parents like actually in the home with us, and we could have all been right. Like, I mean, even now, $20K a month, you can get even in a place like Los Angeles, $20K a month goes a real.
Yeah, for sure.
And so I think about, when we talk about like what it's designed to do, how it's working, how it's not working, and fixing it, I think about the reimagining of how it could operate. And I think there's some things like, FSPA, that I worked on, the work to get extended to 2021 in California. But I think, a complete reimagining is like, all right, well, what if we looked at these cases of like kind of parental generalized neglect, right? And said like, what differently, right? Like, and there are new kind of pilots being, launched across the country around like, so it's like, here's $1,000 a month stipend, right? Like no strings attached. Let's see how that works out. It's like, well, I mean, it could have, sometimes that could be it could be a good effect. We don't really know yet, but also like just giving it to you and seeing how it works out isn't really helpful either, right? So what if we're like, all right, here's $10,000 a month, and let's like work with this family and see how we could use $10,000 a month to support this family, keeping the family together. Does that mean someone's coming during the day, in the evening hours? And that's what we do for folks with developmental disabilities. That's what we do for the elderly, right? So why can't we do these with normal, like I'm saying normal, it's like the wrong word, right? Like just like the average family and child, right? Like, let's see how we're spending the money either way. So let's see if there's a better way to actually allocate those resources effectively, and keep those kids with their like families of origin, I like to use that because kids end up back in foster care from adoption. So there's no permanency per se attached to adoption. There's not always a lack of connection to family, even when you age out of foster care, right? Like, like my biological mother, whom I had no relationship really as a child, is coming to stay at my house for a month this summer in Baltimore, right? It's going to be her first time ever on an airplane, right? And so it's just like, it doesn't mean that you don't have a connection, but it's just a reimagining of what those things look like.
Yeah. And I think, and Ryan, I'm gonna give you a second to chime in too, but I think I want to really touch on something Judge Nash said also when you entered the dependency court. And I think, Dr. King, you had statistics before. I think you was 1 or 3% about the total population in the world who really understood what the foster care system was as a whole. And then how in theory, it felt really good. It sounded really good. And I think the biggest thing for me was that we were conditioned to believe that this is needed and necessary in the way that we're presenting it to support these children that are being abused or neglected. And if we really dive into the child welfare system and the history, and I think I touched on this in another fireside chat, and really looking at it from a racial perspective, Black and brown children, no one cared what was happening with us, way back when. The system originally wasn't created for us. It was created for white children who were orphaned because of World War II. And the second all the funding came and the laws were passed and the services were shifted from private to public, and our separation was in deterioration of our families was then tied to $1, then that's when a lot of interest, in our populations, in our communities, that's when a lot of the interest came. And you see, all this support for, SNAP and Head Start and Medicaid, and just all these different things, which as a result, they manifested from the civil rights movement. While we're fighting to say we need all of these things to support us, on the flip side, it was used to really oppress us. And Dorothy Roberts, who I know you're a huge fan of, she talks about how once the child welfare system became increasingly associated with Black mothers and Black families, it became increasingly burdened with, just different behavior modification rules, work requirements, reduced effective benefits levels. And we were really punished and criminalized for our having to work several jobs, to feed for our family, having to cope with the men in our lives being incarcerated as a result of the war on drugs. And so there, in all of this surveillance that didn't exist in the degree in which it existed on our families, yes, on our Black men, but not necessarily our families, all of this came into play, and various laws were enacted as a result of that in theory were created to help these poor, vulnerable communities that need our help, need our saving. And the one that sticks out the most for me was CAPTA, the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act. And this is one of the policies that I feel does the most harm to our communities. And it's the main driver of why we see so many children and families impacted by the child welfare system, because of our mandated reporting laws. And, we've seen the data. We're actually having a big data summit, which I'm extremely excited about, on May 23rd and 24th, where DCFS and all our county partners and everyone got together and said, hey, we realize there's a problem. We're going to present all of our data. We're going to tell some really strong, empowering stories, and we're going to leave there doing something to correct this finally. But we're seeing that 88% of the children that are in the system are there because of neglect that stems from poverty, not necessarily because they're being abused. And so when we see laws that were created for us, but not by us, and they end up doing kind of the opposite thing, because it sounds good when there's racism and bias, and society perceives us to be inferior or less than, are not able to parent the right way, are not able to provide and take care of our children the right way. And then there's that surveillance where any little thing we do or how we do it is wrong and punished. Now we have this overwhelming system where you said 60,000, almost fell on my chair, Judge Nash. I didn't even realize it was that many back then. I'm thinking the 33,000 we have now was like the most. But to hear that we had 60,000 at one point, and I'm almost certain that the majority of those children and families were Black and brown, you have to ask yourself why. Why do we have laws and policies that exist to punish families, in essence? And when we look at the disproportionality that exists racially, we have to ask ourselves why. Why is it centered in these communities specifically? And then you have the data and the outcomes that show we're not having good experiences, we're not having great outcomes. And I love that you have those decades of experience, Judge Nash, because you get to see that, well-intended or not, it sounds good in theory or not, we try it, and the definition of insanity is doing something over and over and over again and getting the same result. We now are finally reimagining and saying, okay, we have these laws, we have these policies, they didn't work, they're causing harm. And what's worse is that we have this institutional and structural racism that exists via our policies, but it's being perpetuated individually in how we show up in our jobs and our spaces and implement them, and the types of trainings we're giving to our teams. And so I'm gonna stop there. But Ryan, did you have anything to add to that discussion? Because if not, I'll move on to another question. But I really want everyone to look at the history you know, why these laws exist, why do they continue to exist, and how they're being perpetuated, you know, through us. You know, my sister Jessica, she became a social worker because she really wanted to change. You know, she really didn't want kids to have the same experiences she had, and got in through DCFS and realized, oh, there's nothing I could do because there's policies and laws that say no matter how I show up in all my Blackness and all my lived experience, there's nothing I can do because I have to follow these rules. I have to follow these laws. And it's just something to think about as it's structural at the end of the day.
Yeah, absolutely. I think when I think about, you know, reimagining child welfare and reimagining what and why this system is failing, you know, growing up in the foster care system, firsthand, like experiencing it, and going on to what really provoked me to get back into the work was to come to LMU and, you know, learn about this statistic as I'm entering college. It's the 3% statistic, as you know, only 3% of foster youth are going to graduate from a university with their bachelor's degree. And that really shocked me. And that's when I really knew that, you know, kids like me and kids that grow up in this system, like, are not, we don't have an equal playing field. And so I started to do, decided to major in sociology, and I looked around my university here at LMU and realized that we only have, out of the couple thousand students that go here, we only have 6 youth that were in the foster system attending school here. And that shook me even further. And so that's where Do Good Clothing was birthed here, is because we decided that, you know, we know we're not the smartest people in the room and we can't, you know, do the reimagining, but we can support the people who are doing the reimagining. And I think that that's very important to realize and make in the front piece going forward. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I want to add that we can be the people doing the reimagining. And I think the reason why so much is changing now is because we've insisted on no longer, you know, settling for serving our issues at the bottom, but it's imperative that we lead our issues at the top. And so a lot of the reimagining we see now is because people like us have literally, you know, pulled ourselves up by the bootstraps. You know, like you said earlier, we checked every box, we did everything you said, did everything right, you know, worked twice as hard to get where we are, so that I know for me personally, everything I did was methodical. It was planned. I became the person I am on purpose because I knew I wanted to grow up in a world where my children one day want to be taken from me. I knew that I couldn't sit at tables and sit in rooms and say anything and people listen to me. I had to literally legitimize myself in these spaces because having experienced it alone wasn't good enough. I wasn't the expert. I would sit next to people and they were the experts on my issues. I would sit on panels and be paid $25 for gas while the next person next to me received a $25,000 check while they talked about my issues. And it really blew my mind. And so once we started to speak up about this and started to vocalize it and say, no, everything we do has to be centering the children and the families we're serving. Our voices have to be at the table. We don't need you to be our voice, but we need co-conspirators. We need people that are going to use their privilege, use their access and their platforms in support of our issues, not co-opt our issues, but in support of our issues, realizing that we don't have the privilege all the time to speak up in the way we want to, feel heard, feel valued in those spaces. And so I'm just really appreciative of everything you're doing, Ryan. And I went to LMU, you know, I go to LMU now for my doctorates, and I remember being one of 2 people, me and Angelica Nwandu, the founder of the Shade Room. We were in college, you know, together, trying to figure things out as one of the very few, you know, foster kids there, not getting any benefits, not even realizing what support existed until we asked. But I appreciate what you said, and I want to go back to you, Judge Nash, because back in 2000. Well, maybe I forget the year, but there's a Blue Ribbon Commission on foster youth for child protection. And from that report, that's kind of where the Office of Child Protection was birthed. And you kind of were there at the beginning. And that's when, we had the case of Gabriel Fernandez, who was, killed by his parents. And there was an outcry and uproar to really focus more on child protection. And I'm just curious to hear through that experience of, when that first started and what we're seeing now, what we're learning, this whole reimagining of child welfare, prioritizing child and family well-being, but still protecting children, but understanding the need to also support parents and where they're coming from, because to help the child, sometimes you have to support and help the parent. I'm just, just really curious to learn about how, your lens then versus your lens now, and, what you feel you needed during that process or even need now, or the types of support that should have been there versus not there. Take it where you want, but just curious to see, because so much time has passed, how are things, how is that looking, and how are you pivoting now that we're, in this vein, and that pendulum shift has occurred, moving from child protection to now child and family well-being. I'm packing how you like. I know that was a lot.
Yeah, it is a lot, the Gabriel Fernandez case, was the catalyst for the Blue Ribbon Commission on child protection. And one of the recommendations was that there be this office created, the Office of Child Protection, that'd be in charge of everybody. That is all the county departments and agencies that work with children and families. And quite frankly, I want you to know that when I read that report, I said, it ain't going to happen. Okay. The county may create that office, but they will never give it that kind of authority, because that would almost be like creating a sixth supervisor. And I knew that the Board of Supervisors would never do that, because in the past, whenever they gave a lot of power to one entity like the CEO, they always took it back because they had buyer's remorse about that. So I figured if that office was created, okay, what it would be more than anything else was a facilitator to work with other agencies and entities to enhance communication, cooperation, and coordination with respect to issues involving children and families, as well as those issues that were raised by the Blue Ribbon Commission's report. And quite frankly, moving into that office in many respects was a natural for me, because in my almost 20 years as presiding judge of the juvenile court here in Los Angeles, that was my mantra, the 3 C's: communication, cooperation, and coordination. When I became presiding judge in 1997, I said that's exactly what I was going to do. I was going to work with everybody to improve the system, which was actually a shock to many people, because before I was presiding judge, I was a terrorist judge. I was the meanest, nastiest judge that ever worked in a dependency court, because number one, I terrorized social workers, perhaps more than I needed to. But I pushed everybody, because I said, we need to do better in this system for these kids, okay? And I don't, look, I said to social workers, it's my job to push you to the brink and beyond. I'll fight for more resources for you, but the most important thing for me is what we do for these kids. And that's the way it's been. So as with the Office of Child Protection, what do? Well, we have been working to hopefully implement some of the recommendations from the Blue Ribbon Commission's report in 2014. We also respond to numerous motions from the Board of Supervisors, including I'm frequently asked to take a look at a case where a child subsequent to Gabriel, which is the worst of all of them, but I'm asked to take a look at cases that involve a child fatality, or a case where a child's been hurt in some way, and look for ways to make systemic recommendations, and of course then work with agencies, hopefully to implement some of those recommendations, as well as come up with some ideas of our own. So we have worked in a number of areas. If you look at child welfare as a continuum, our office, small as it is, has projects along that whole continuum, starting with prevention. We published a prevention plan back in 2016, which essentially had three major elements. That is, work with the community agencies, the prevention and aftercare networks, to support them so that they can work with more families to hopefully keep them out of the system. Secondly, let's focus on some of the truly evidence-based programs that help children and families, like home visiting. Our goal is universal home visiting, but we have made some inroads in expanding home visiting over the years, and also early care and education. Those are three areas that hopefully, if they're done right, can help not only folks in the system, but keep folks out of the system, which is our main goal today. Let's serve as many people in the communities as we can. I've always said from day one that the child welfare system, or whatever you want to call it, the families that should come into this system are the ones that are the worst, that we're talking about severe abuse and neglect, that truly need some form of government intervention to protect the children. The rest of them, we should be working in ways to divert them from coming into the system. We've never done it very well, okay? But fortunately, today, there is much more attention on that. We've also over the years, when I came into the system, I said, look, we're detaining kids left and right, okay? And I don't understand how we're assessing these families. I used to call it the John Wayne School of risk assessment. All right, you're assessing families by the seat of their pants. We need a much more sophisticated and meaningful way to assess families than bring those truly at risk with safety issues into the system. Well, the best tool we've come up with thus far is structured decision making, and it can help if it's done right, okay? It's never been done right in LA County. We've focused with DCFS and others over the last few years to hopefully make it better.
Yeah.
The jury's out on that, okay?
Yeah.
Also, we know from all sorts of studies that, look, if we're going to intervene with a family, the best place for children to be is not with a stranger, not within congregate care, but with their own family, okay? And certainly, I think we've been pretty successful with the work that we've done with their Upfront Family Finding Project, which is still not countywide as much as I've been pushing it for the last 5 or 6 years, but it's made some significant inroads in that. We work on education issues. We've worked on crossover issues. One of the issues that has always been near and dear to my heart is psychotropic medications. We're leading the county in how we utilize psychotropic medications because we know this is a very important issue for our children. So, any number of issues that we've been addressing with other folks since we've been in existence. And for those of you out there, our website, www.ocp.lacounty.gov, is filled with all the reports that we've done over the years. And one of the things that we've done since I've been there, basically from the get-go, is I file a public report every 3 months so that the Board of Supervisors and everybody that's interested knows exactly what we're doing, okay? And if they like it, fine. If they don't like it, they can tell us, okay? But the bottom line is we want to be as transparent as possible in everything that we do, and I think we've done that fairly successfully. So that's just, I can talk for hours about this, but we have limited time here today.
Thank you. I see you on mic, Dr. Adeoye. So did you want to?
Yeah. I mean, there's just so much to unpack here. I think one of the things that I always think about is this idea of who has done it right. So we've talked about the exclusion of Black and brown families from foster care, mostly up until the 90s, and we know what was happening, right? Like in the 80s, 90s, right? And so then the question becomes, what was happening to those kids then, prior to that point? Right. And so we always talk, like, there's always blue ribbon commissions at the advent of a catastrophe. And what we don't do enough is think about, all right, let's create a blue ribbon commission on analyzing the factors of success. Right. So kind of, there are a few of us on the line who are, have aged out of foster care, have a lived experience, whatever, like, technical definition we want to use, whatever, right? What we know is that folks with a lived experience in foster care who go on to complete a bachelor's degree are more likely than their non-foster care peers to go on to graduate school. So I think about myself, only 1% of the population, period, under 30 have a doctoral level degree. Let's get a blue ribbon commission to understand what it is that led these folks, right, to excel in spite of the trauma, in spite of the adversity, and all of these things, right? So when we're looking at like all of these commissions and what are like leading to outcomes, we're looking at like programs and things, but what we forget is the people. Let's talk to the people. We talk about only 3% get a bachelor's degree. By the time I got my degree, I was disconnected from a system. How far along are these kind of longitudinal studies tracking? Are they actually doing data matching post age 25, post age 30? Because we know that folks who have had traumatic childhood experiences do enroll in and continue and persist in college at later stages in life. So like, we're not actually giving a full story of what's happening and what success looks like. And so if we're looking at like success is, at 18, you're enrolled in college, by 21, you're like ending or nearing completion. Well, that's like, you're doomed to fail because you're asking the wrong questions, right? Are you happy? Are you kind of creating a sustainable life for yourself? Are you employed? Are you happy with your job, right? Like, those are like questions I think that we should be asking about what success is for folks who have this lived experience, not these kind of like traditional, like government mandated things. And so if I come back to like what I studied in my doctoral program was really I looked at the Black Panther Party, right? And looked at, well, what was it that made them a model for elementary education in the state? Because I'm not in Cali anymore, but now previous governor, who was governor back in the 70s, right, like Brown, said, hey, look, we need to be looking at what they're doing. The Black Panthers, Oakland Community School is a model for elementary education, and we should be replicating this, right? But we didn't, right? So we're looking at like what's happening, what's working, but then in the Black community for Black folks, right, to serve Black families, and yet we aren't analyzing what was really going on and why it was that they were being successful. As an anecdote, here's what they did. They didn't have a stop sign on the street corner and kids were getting hit on the right, like on their way to school. They stood out with shotguns to make sure that kids could cross the street successfully until the government intervened, right? Not advocating standing on the corner with shotguns. But what I'm really thinking about is like, how do we look at not just these programs that, are government funded, government mandated now, but like, what is it really like at the heart of like, how are folks with the lived experience defining success, right? I think about people like my brother, who does not have the traditional 4-year education. He defines himself as very successful. He is a parent. He has a wife. He is in the process of buying a home. Like, he's doing all of these things. He's not included in any of the like data tracking mechanisms for what success looks like. He's only 31, 32. I don't know how old he is, whatever, right? But like, so like when we talk about longitudinal studies, we're generally stopping at 25. And it's just like, well, yeah, if you stop there, then like, sure, everybody's like sucks, like, right? Like all of the outcomes are very poor. And that's not to say that we shouldn't be looking for like ways to create like more meaningful outcomes. But I think about me, like my first kid was when I was 21. And by the time I was 26, I had a doctorate. So like, but like by that definition of like, young parenting, right? Like, oh, I was like not on the track of like towards successful transition to adulthood. And so I think we just really have to like remember, like, we have to talk to the people, especially like those that are decades beyond, and really to get a fuller picture of what's happening.
Yeah, and that's so crazy because looking back, I don't think I've ever been a part of any research or filled out any survey. Like there's nothing that exists. And many of us aren't even known about. We don't know how many are actually successful or out there killing it, because once we leave, we're like you said earlier, leave me alone. I don't want to talk about it. It's so much easier for me to go about this life, not saying I was a impacted by the child welfare system or foster care system or juvenile justice system. Like having to like relive that is intentional for me because it's a part of my my healing journey, but also in order to change some of the things that that harmed me. But it's so easy for us to, once we become successful or once we figure it like out enough to be comfortable, whatever that means for us, we don't revisit that, and so, and if no one's asking, we definitely aren't, highlighting that information. We only have 9 minutes left, and I want to, ask you all, we've thrown out this term, reimagine. I want to know what that term means, for each of you individually, and what are you doing in support of reimagining that definition you have of child welfare. And if you want, I can start us off while y'all think about it. So for me, I'm an abolitionist. Everyone knows it. It's not a secret. That's what it is. Reimagining child welfare is collectively the community, the individuals impacted by it, the systems that already exist, coming together and re-identifying a new solution. One that you said earlier, Judge Nash, where we have a system that's specifically geared towards supporting those children and families that are actually being abused. We do not have the ability or capacity to really focus on children being abused because we're so busy focusing on policing and surveilling everybody else. So having something that actually focuses on that and focuses on it from a healing and restorative perspective, but also realizing that we need to reckon with the histories of our past, put the energy, the funding, the support and resources back into the community, fund community-based organizations and people with lived experience to then go in and support our community, support our neighbors, our sisters and brothers, because before there was funding, we were the village. We took care of each other and we did it very well. If mama was gone, auntie, neighbor, sister, cousin, we figured it out. We were fed, we were clothed, we supported each other from slavery until now. And so reimagining, not with us, but letting us lead what that reimagining should look like, a system that works in support of healing and restoring our communities and no longer surveilling and policing them. And I'll leave it there. And CASA LA is doing that because we're rolling out a prevention and intervention program. We're prioritizing, really seeing and understanding the context of the histories in which our children and families come from, providing culturally competent and responsive recommendations and solutions in support of our children. And on an individual level, just regardless of what our titles are and all the fancy, cute stuff, how can I show up each and every day in support of my community and the things that I believe in? So.
Well, I don't want to forget, the abolitionist, as you call it, so to speak, or, or Dorothy Roberts, it has written, as I understand it, is not necessarily breaking down the system completely as it currently exists, but it does, change the complete emphasis of the system, which is once again towards families, okay, serving families in their communities, which is the best way to work with families. And to the extent that families get involved with the system, keep the families involved in the process, okay, limit congregate care. And there are discussions about new programs, that could possibly make a difference. And I support these types of programs, whether it's giving money directly to youth or to families. This idea about having people being represented by lawyers before they come into the system so they can keep them out of the system, or this idea of that the county is working on called blind removals, which is designed hopefully to make the system colorblind. The literature is, mixed on that. However, if the county wants to experiment on that, which they do, then I think we should support it and let's see what happens. Okay. The bottom line here is, I subscribe to the theory or to the mantra stated by Voltaire many years ago, which is that no problem can withstand the assault of sustained thinking. And at this point, there is a lot of that going on, and it's a good thing, and hopefully it will lead us to a good place as time goes on.
Thank you. Brian or Dr. Gabriel, what's your definition of reimagine? And they don't all have to be the same, and that's okay. And
Yeah, I think reimagine means for me, and what it means for myself and my team here is that we want to create a community around this cause and around building awareness and raising funds to support the organizations that have had like a huge effect on me and continue to fight for, you know, the betterment of child welfare. Yeah.
Love that. Thank you. And I think you answered one of the questions in the chat too, is when you have that access and privilege and resources, then you give it back and support those that are serving in the trenches every day.
I feel that another thing, a part of our organization is to build up more foster care leaders. So leaders that have experienced the foster care system, we want to put them in the spotlight and help them help us make a better for tomorrow for the foster children of today.
I love that.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I'll be brief. I think I kind of alluded to this a little bit ago, but you know, for me, reimagining, you know, this kind of system is really a tearing it down and really kind of thinking through a reconnection to community, right? So one thing that my grandmother loves to say is, you know, it starts at home, right? That's where she always says, and I'm always reminding her, but it does not end there. It continues in the community. So for me, a reimagining of this child welfare system is really a reconnecting to our community, the ancestral community, right? Like around like, just like, what does it mean to be in a space where all folks are thriving, right? So you can't have a child welfare system without an education system that is designed to meet the needs of all kids, which means you then must reimagine an education system. You must then reimagine a public health system. And I would definitely be remiss to say that we're at an interesting point when we think about the recent or upcoming ruling, right, on Roe v. Wade, where you're in a state like California that presumes to be liberal haven, right? But remember that you have a large number of undocumented folks, a number of folks who are afraid of a racist healthcare system. So even though there is a kind of will be a state mandated right to access to abortion, people are afraid of a healthcare system. So then we must think about, well, what does that mean for our foster care system down the road, right? So if we're going to reimagine, we have to reimagine and think about every single potential like entry point into this system, and like how do you reimagine and reevaluate the racist kind of roots of every one of these institutions that then create the system of governing and surveilling Black and brown bodies in Los Angeles, in California, in the United States, and the globe at large. So.
And that's so true. And I'm gonna grab a book. Y'all know I like to tell y'all about it. But that is so true, because if we look at our incarceration system, homelessness, it all stems from our child welfare system. So think of the domino effect that we'll have once we reimagine a system that feeds all the other systems. My goodness, we'll actually have a society that works together, serves together, supports one another. Granted, we still got to address racism. That's the big elephant in the room. We got to address that. But there's so much opportunity, so much low-hanging fruit to really show up in our individual capacities and organization capacities. But we're at time, but I'm going to leave you with a book. Before I told you about Dorothy Roberts' book, The Color of Child Welfare, where she just 20 years later, she came out with her new book, Torn Apart. And so this is her looking back 20 years and really looking at everything that's transpired since. And I think you'll really love reading this, Judge Nash, because you lived through that whole era, and you're really talking down about how she defines abolition. And it's a lot of what everybody touched on here, and how we, can really work to, reckon with what's happened, but also collectively, restore. Like it has to be all of us working together in support of this. So thank you all so very much for your time, your brilliance, your servitude. I really appreciate you all. And we will have this fireside chat on our website soon, along with all the other ones. Thank you. And it's Dorothy Roberts for those asking in the chat.